Hello, everyone. My name is Othman Al-Akkad. I'm the VP of Technology at Ejabi InfoSec, and we are welcoming you today with us for this workshop about the PCI DSS compliance in the cloud infrastructure and the cloud environment. Basically, the workshop will be about understanding what is the compliance perspective at the cloud environment, and what is the responsibility for each party whom are included in this this assessment. Nevertheless, please do not hesitate to ping me or to raise your hand in case you have any question at any point during the workshop. Thank you all, and we are going to start. First of all, Ejabi InfoSec, I'm going to brief the company in a couple of words. Ejabi InfoSec is a cybersecurity and compliance company established in early 2020. And we are from the very first PCI QSA companies in the Middle East. We are interested in proactive cybersecurity, which try to reduce and mitigate the threat before it happens. So we think in proactive way. First of all, why the PCI in cloud, and why we are talking about cloud computing and the cloud compliance. Recently, many companies started to stop investing in building their infrastructure, bringing the equipment, maybe investing in physical location, and instead of that, they started to use the cloud computing, first of all, to reduce cost, and second, to benefit from the high resources that they can benefit for computing or for the high availability, regardless if it's the HQ or the DR or just like a public service is used. Let's start with some definition about the cloud computing. So it's like a formal computing distributed that enables access and for scalable environment and infrastructure. Recently, it became more elastic and more scalable, so you can scale your data center in cloud or your application for any resources in a very seamless way. I'm going to define some definition, then we can move in the main concepts. First of all, the provider, or we call it the cloud service provider. The cloud service provider is the entity that has the cloud service or hosting the cloud service. So it's the entity providing the cloud services. It's acquire and manage the infrastructure. It runs, it facilitates. The cloud service provider mainly does everything for the cloud infrastructure. They build it, they manage it, they administrate it, but in a very strategic way and defined way. The customer, in an easy way, we can call it the subscriber, the entity that subscribes the service from the service provider. Maybe like some companies, merchant, payment processor, maybe banks, they host their data centers or core banking over the cloud. So in this case, we call it customer. The third part, the third definition, actually, it's called the user. And user is the employee that works for the customer. So behind each entity or customer that subscribe from cloud service provider, there is a set of employees that are working to run their services. We call them in the compliance as the user. Next of the multi-tenancy or the multi-tenant. Before the multi-tenancy invented and this concept came to the world, the users used to use a single tenant of application for each. So for me, I have my application and my database. For another customer or another person, he has his application and his database, the third, so on. So instead of using single application for each and with the resources, the multi-tenancy came to do some allocation for physical and logical resources that multiple cloud tenant into one tenant. So instead of using X applications, we are doing, or you are using one application, but for X users. And the same as well for the database. So the only one multi-tenant application deals with one multi-tenant database or X multi-tenant database based on the business need. So by using the multi-tenancy, we are unifying the application, and we are optimizing the usage of the resources instead of dedicated in a very thick way. The cloud tenant, so we talked about the multi-tenancy. The cloud tenant is basically my tenant in the multi-tenancy concept. So it's like one or more customers sharing the access of set of resources and virtual either or logical. And here we have like a very small example, like we have the customer X and customer Y. Instead of creating separate portal for each, they are accessing one portal. Once they log in, they will redirect it for their applications and their VMs and their resources as a management, as the computing resources, as their network in case they have infrastructure as a service or platform as a service or virtual private cloud. And in the back end, for sure, they will be accessing their enterprise databases or stores. How to evaluate a cloud service provider? Now I am a customer or a subscriber, let's say in another way, and I want to evaluate is this the service provider that really fits my need, or I should look for another one. First of all, I should understand my risk and what is my security requirement. Is it allowed to me to host on like a cloud service, or I should keep it for my own data? What's the risk if I keep it at my premises or I move it to the cloud? First, I have to understand what is the defined risk. The second one is to choose the deployment model. The deployment model, actually, it's one of the very critical role player in cloud services, and choosing and selecting the role model will define my responsibility, my budgetary, my operation cost, my each aspect, actually. So I should understand what is the model I'm going to use and what is the risk to use this model. Okay, and then after I understand this aspect, I have to evaluate different service options. So I am going to use infrastructure as a service, maybe SaaS, a function as a service, maybe platform as a service. So I have to understand what I want to, the service option of hosting, and then what I want from the service provider. So maybe I want support from him. No, I want only like level 1 support, level 2, level 3. And then after that, I can compare the providers and their offering regarding the cost, regarding the service availability, maybe the disaster recovery, the high availability, and so on. There's like particular questions we may ask the service provider. For example, what does each service consist of exactly? What's the packages? Many service providers now are in race, actually, who deliver the best service or the best package with the least cost. How does the service provider maybe maintain the PCI compliance? How do they segment their networks? Maybe if I am a customer or subscriber and I want like some evidence or some document from the service provider for my compliance, is it kept up to date? What is their compliance journey? Once I decide, we will be moving for contractual part, and we start the documentation between the customer maybe or the cloud service provider to put a valid and proper agreement that guarantee the guardianship and the ownership for data and rights for both parties. Finally, the allocation of responsibility between the customer and the service provider actually does not exempt the customer or the subscriber from their role in protecting the cardholder data. So even if some part is related to the cloud hosting or cloud service provider, this does not exempt me as a customer to follow up, to request, to ensure that some requirements or some controls have properly met. Moving on to cloud deployment model, as I said before, like we have to choose the cloud deployment model that we want. First model, it's the public model or the public cloud. The public cloud actually is cloud computing model where the cloud service is available publicly. So the public service or the cloud service is accessible for the public internet. So it's for like everyone. Maybe like now we have Amazon, we have Google Firebase, and many services now is public cloud that you can only enter the website of the cloud service provider, allocate your services, agree the terms, and your cloud service is accessible from the public and you can get it instantly. The second model, which is most preferred for the financial industries, maybe that they don't have public services, which is the private service. The private service is called somehow the virtual private cloud. The virtual private cloud is like your data center, but it's not in your premises, and you only have the access for these premises. It can be accessible through leased line, protected network, or a VPN. Depends on the geographical distribution of this server or this cloud premises. The third one is a community cloud. The community cloud is cloud service or cloud service provider, but they are dedicated in a very vertical business. Like maybe you have cloud infrastructure for machine learning. So it's dedicated for prepared well with good GPUs, with good infrastructure to handle the type of data. Maybe another community cloud would be dedicated for the financial service. Another one maybe for oil and gas. So the community cloud actually is either public or private cloud, but its service, it's dedicated for a special industry. The hybrid model actually it's either private and community or public that keep the entities benefit from multiple models at the same time, and mostly it's used in creating headquarter site and DR site, so you can put your HQ and DR inside a private cloud, and maybe you can publish your public services to community cloud. Then we have the cloud service categories. Actually, the categories is now became a very elastic terms. You can use any terms now and put as a service, put it in the cloud, and you have a new categories. But now I am mentioning for the only the well-known and defined by the PCI Council. Yeah, I think we have a question. I'm sorry for stopping, but let's listen. Go ahead, Ms. Zainab. Hello? I think you are muted. Anyway, I will keep the workshop, and you can we can discuss later in the panel discussion your question. Thank you. So the cloud service categories, actually, this is the main categories defined by the payment card industry, but later on, any like service, it can be used as a service in cloud that you can define it as service categories. We have the colocation, the infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and the system as a service. Recently, there are disaster recovery as a service, which is like community clouds, but it's dedicated and it's equipped to be as ready to use DR. There is a function as a service, like you can request only function or API from cloud service providers, so they call it function as a service. Let's dig deep in these terms and start the explanation. So the co-location service or co-location, the co-location is the ability to utilize the physical facility of the cloud service provider. So I have my equipment, I have my infrastructure, my hardware, but I don't have the physical location. Maybe I don't have the proper power resource, the proper cooling system, the proper ventilation system, and I want to get this proper area ready to use. So this service is called co-location, that I benefit from the physical infrastructure and the physical facility of the cloud service provider. Co-location, as I said, it's very effective when I have my infrastructure ready, my hardware is ready, but I don't know where to place this infrastructure in a good running time environment. The infrastructure as a service, this is the very first term to be shared with the cloud service provider. The infrastructure as a service, it's the capability of the customer to utilize the hardware of the cloud service provider. So I get the server, I get the hardware, maybe the firewall, the intrusion prevention. This ownership will become my asset, my context. Maybe I get context of firewall. I have the full authority to administrate my context. In this case, we call it the infrastructure as a service. So like usage of the fundamental computing resources to deploy and run my services. The platform as a service is the capability of the customer to deploy the application. So in this case, like I own the operating system. I don't have the authority to run the hardware, to patch the BIOS, to ensure that the firmwares or the fundamental or the very first layer of infrastructure is under my authority. So my authority in this case starts from the operating system and forward. The system as a service, actually, here we have like our authority as the subscriber or as a client is to use the application itself. So even for the operating system, I don't have the authority. I have the authority to access the application. It could be web application or web browsing or program interface. Actually, to be honest, these are the very first or the defined terms by the PCI Council for the cloud service provider as categories. And maybe we can like combine the infrastructure and the platform and the service maybe, and combine them into a very strategic model and create the DR as a service. Maybe I can get an API from the system as a service model, only developing APIs and give it to the customers. So now it will become like a function as a service or FaaS. Okay, now we defined what is cloud and what is the models and the categories. Now, what are the PCI DSS responsibility? Okay, so the concept of shared or joint responsibility can be particularly tricky. Why? Because myself as a customer or myself as a cloud service provider, what should I deliver to the opposite party? What should I request from them to give to me? What is my authority? What is their authority? Okay, so everything should be defined in a very straightforward way, so everyone knows what is their roles and responsibility. And starting from the co-location, reaching the SaaS service, and gradually the responsibility start to be shifting from client responsibility to the cloud service provider responsibility. So if I assume like I am the client and I'm using the co-location system, the only thing that I'm talking commonly, in a very common way. If I'm using the co-location, the client responsibility will become like 90% or maybe 95% of the compliance or the guardianship of the environment. Because if I'm using the co-location, I will be responsible for maintaining the firewalls. I will be responsible for patching the system. I'll be responsible for the logical requirements. The only thing that I will be sharing with the cloud service provider in this case is the physical controls. The physical controls, because I'm using their infrastructure, they have the access control system, they have the CCTV system. So in this case, we should collaborate, or we should share the responsibility of this control. Start moving upward, maybe for infrastructure as a service. No, in the case of infrastructure as a service, it will be start to be more shareable with the cloud service provider. In past, the cloud service provider will have the responsibility to maintain the very fundamental infrastructure. I have to maintain starting from the operating system. In the SaaS, no. In the SaaS, the cloud service provider shall maintain till the operating system. So they should be ensure the physical security, the logical security, the system patching, the network configuration, the firewall rules, the risk ranking, the vulnerability assessment, the penetration testing, the approved scanning vendor. Reaching to the SaaS, no, it start to be migrated, but it's not 100% for each, because if the CSP has 100% responsibility, so the client has no benefit from this. Here we have the 12 requirement of the PCI. We created like a matrix to show it clearly. If you can see in the co-location, the very first column, the customer has 90 or 90% of the requirement. Only like in physical, it's shared in regular testing, because the cloud service provider shall test the physical infrastructure like access control or CCTV, doing some regular testing, and ensure that the security policy for these are maintained well. In the infrastructure as a service, no, it starts to be like more shared than dedicated to the customer. Like installing and maintaining the firewall, it will be shared. Requirement number 2, do not use the vendor default credentials, restrict the logical physical access. The logical, it's shared, the physical, no, because the infrastructure as a service, mostly I don't reach the environment. I reach it logically, not physically. And the platform as a service is start to be more shared once we reach to the SaaS service. The SaaS service is mostly like shifted to the cloud service provider responsibility. Here I have an example. For example, like the requirement number 6. The requirement number 6 state that to develop and maintain secure systems and application. And here we have to include like the patch management, the risk ranking, the WASP top 10 in case we have in-house developed or non-certified application. Okay, if I'm checking the requirement number 6 and I am using the infrastructure as a service. So what will be the responsibility for each part? Okay, so first of all, patching and maintenance the operating system will be the customer responsibility, but patching and maintenance for the underlying layer or underlying devices, it will be the provider. So maybe the customer requires some infrastructure as a service, some VMs, some ESX nodes. Maintaining this layer will be the responsibility of the customer, but if we are talking about the firmware and the BIOS and these underlying, it's the provider. Okay. Then the virtual device as its infrastructure as a service, so it will be the responsibility of the customer. Okay, so if I am aiming to requirement number 6, and we are talking about platform as a service, maybe not infrastructure as a service. So patching and maintenance of underlying devices remain the responsibility of the provider. But the entities will need to determine which party is responsible for applying the patches, because we are talking about developing systems. We are talking about patching applications. So in this case, the roles and responsibility should clearly define who is responsible for what. And patching the application mainly will be the responsibility of the customer. And this at the end, depending on the services level and agreement. Okay, and if I'm talking about SaaS, and I am aiming or referring to requirement number 6, so the customer may control or manage the application. It could be shared like with the host service provider. The provider typically manage and patch everything from operating system or application or underlying layer in the SaaS model. So because of that, at the very first beginning of our workshop, we mentioned that we should define what we need from the cloud service provider, what is our responsibilities and what is their responsibilities, what is the model that we are going to use, and what is our aim target from using the cloud service. Okay, segmentation is the very powerful role in the PCI DSS compliance, either in on-premises or in cloud. Because if I don't use network segmentation and I have flat networks, this will make and enlarge my scope in a very massive way. So the segmentation is a very critical role. I should segment my network very good way and use advanced technology and advanced technique to ensure that my subscribers is isolated from each other, and even some subscribers require an isolation inside their services, inside their models. So I have to ensure that I place and I do my segmentation in a very proper way, so I could comply with PCI and reduce my scope to the minimum. There is a very large variety models of network segmentation. It can be like traditional application service provider, and it's a very traditional way to do the segmentation by giving each customer their dedicated physical server or physical environment. So another way, like physically separate server and provide the customer the cardholder data environment. The other way is the virtualized server. The virtualized server is now more common, a way to do resources allocation, and instead like giving physical infrastructure or physical server for the client, we are going to giving them VMs and pools and volumes allocation for the storage area. Some controls of the segmentation that could be used by the cloud service provider or requested by the customer and subscriber could be firewalls, could be intrusion prevention, could be proper VLANing, could be data loss prevention. In case we have like containers, it should be isolated based on industry standard and vetted technology. We should be using strong and multi-factor authentication. Maybe software-defined network. There are actually many techniques to do the network segmentation. And proper testing for network segmentation should be applied after doing this segmentation to ensure that there is no breach or no misconfiguration happened in this segmentation. The service level agreement, and it's actually one of the most typical and most critical part in using cloud service provider. So in the service level agreement, we should define who is responsible for what. And it's like the contractual way and the service that the cloud service provider deliver the service for me. Each term should be defined well. I should be able to request any document that help my compliance journey, state my authority, my guardianship over the data, who is responsible for security testing, for example, who is responsible for patching, like in case I need to access my co-location, for example, site, I should define when can I access it and whom can access this environment. These terms and conditions must all be contractually noted, written under a signed document from both parties. I have now like small case studies to discuss. For example, the case study number 1 is like we have a private cloud hosted and controlled by entity seeking PCI DSS compliant with segmentation. So here we are talking about cloud service provider want to do PCI compliance and there is a segmentation in the network. The description of the environment, all CDE VMs or containers are hosted on single dedicated hypervisor. Non-CDE VMs are hosted on separated hypervisors. So in this case, like we have two types of physical servers, CDE servers and non-CDE servers. Validated segmentation of the CDE system from non-CDE to the CDE is done. So we have like a very well segmented network. In this case, what will be the guidance? The guidance, actually, the CDE hypervisor, VM, and containers, all system components that are not segmented will be on scope. So first of all, we defined like we have two types of servers, the CDE server and non-CDE. For each VM and server inside the CDE, if there is no segmentation within these servers, all these servers considered a flat network. So here we have to include all these items in the PCI DSS scope. The case study number 2, third party providing hosting PCI compliant for multiple users with validated segmentation for network environment, for customer environment. So the environment description, VMs may be one or multiple hypervisor. All hypervisors are configured by provider to support the PCI DSS requirement. Multiple customers are hosted on each hypervisor. One or more containers run with one or more dedicated container orchestration server, and validated segmentation of customer environment using combination of physical and logical controls. The guidance, okay, as long as the provider is responsible for compliance of all elements for each underlying PCI DSS cloud service, so it should be provided for the customer. And each customer scope would be its own environment. So if I am using a cloud service and I want to do PCI for me, so my compliance journey will only be for my environment, as long as the network is very well segmented from each others. The case study number 3, actually, it's like a provider or cloud service provider that is providing a security service that may affect a cardholder data or the CDE. For example, let's say I have my multi-factor authentication system hosted on the cloud, or maybe I'm using 3D secure system hosting in the cloud, or maybe authorization server, maybe a service, a payment transaction aggregator, sorry. Any service that may affect the security of CDE or in scope service is hosted in the cloud. So in this case, the infrastructure as a service or the platform configured by the cloud service provider, this service that is cloud to support the PCI DSS. In this case, I am as a customer, okay, I'm responsible for compliance based on the responsibility that we showed like in slides before. Because the cloud service provider may offer for me the infrastructure as a service, but the maintenance and keeping this program and service running is the customer, or the, let's say I am a vendor that I am using a cloud to host my service. So in this case, maintaining this service compliant for the PCI is mostly, I'm not saying 100%, is my responsibility, and it should be part of my PCI journey in cooperation with some sharing responsibility from the cloud service provider, and maybe from physical aspect or from security testing procedures. The case number 4, and it's a very became well-known case recently, which is like, let's assume I am a customer, subscriber, maybe bank or payment service provider, that I want to use cloud service to host my disaster recovery site or some services I have. So here, I should be asking myself as a question, what do I want to host in the cloud? Maybe headquarter, hot DR, warm DR, or cold DR, because here we have to understand the regulatory and what is the main regulation and terms in my country or my industry. I should understand the capex of opex of running this service in cloud and on-premise. Maybe if I am I'm using a very wide range from the cloud services, and I compared my cost from hosting and the cost of creating my own site, and maybe it would be cheaper if I'm doing my own. At the end, it's all related to financial and terms. And ask the regulatory. Maybe I don't have a cloud that supports my compliance in my country, and the regulatory enforces me, if I want to use a cloud, I should use a cloud inside my country. So in this case, the cloud service provider will not be a good option for me as long as it's not compliant or it's not fulfilling my need. After asking myself and answering these questions, I should be moving to ask the provider what the model they have. I'm going back to the very first slide I showed, the questions. What the model they have. Are they PCI compliant? If they said yes, then you have to request the AOC document, the attestation of compliance, because it's the only proof that they are cloud service provider. And you should be very careful about the cloud service provider scope, because some cloud service provider may be compliant to only co-location, though, so they are compliant with the physical access controls. They are not compliant with anti-malware or the requirement number 1 for network configuration, or requirement number 2. So you should be requesting the AOC and check the scope page to understand what is the services that they are compliant with. Then we can move to ask the service provider what additional services they can offer for me. So if they can like offer monitoring, maybe hardening, maybe health check, maybe maintenance, level 1 support, level 2. It depends on my operation and my capacity of work. And then we have to ask the provider who has the physical access to data center and system, to check the responsibility matrix, to check the physical access, how the premises is accessible. Like for example, if I found that the cloud service provider is not securing my infrastructure well, then this will be like a very tricky point in using the cloud service. Maybe the site will not be well protected. And the last and not least question, because there are many questions to ask the cloud service provider, how the data storage system protected from physical and direct console access. So I'm reverting now to the question number one, from the questions to client. What do I need? Because like if I'm having HQ or having ODR or maybe warm DR, so there is many consideration to put in this case studies. So I should understand well who has the access and how do they have the access. For example, in emergency, in case of any incident happen, how can we collaborate, and each one does their responsibility in a very good manner. I'm moving now to a small quiz, just like for making more interactive. You can check the proper answer you see, and then we can evaluate. Okay. So yeah, I'll do it like for 1 minute. Okay, so yes. Okay, so yeah, correct. So actually, most of the people answered shared. Actually, yes, it is shared between the provider and the customer. Pool number two. Remember, this is security as this is system as a service. So I'm using only the application. I am a customer who is only using an application. So managing another things, is it my responsibility or the cloud, or it's shared between myself and the provider? Okay, so most of you answered correctly. Yeah, this is the correct answer is the second one. It's actually the responsibility of the cloud service provider to manage the anti-malware. Okay. So now we have co-location considering the requirement number 9. the requirement number 9, which is the physical access management, and I'm using colocation. I'm using the physical premises. So complying with this requirement will be the responsibility of myself or the provider, or shared. I'm using the physical facility, maybe the physical room, and I'm placing my equipment. Okay, so actually it's shared because from service provider perspective, as long as it's compliant with the co-location, so they should be managing the physical access control system as it's considered on their premises. But in my PCI journey as a subscriber who is using this room, maintaining a well and ensuring that the records are well maintained is also my responsibility. So yeah, it's shared. So the software as a service is the capability to use the cloud infrastructure, to use the hardware, to use the firewall, to use, I don't know, maybe the server itself. Great. So most of you answered correctly, as long as I'm using the provider application. So I'm not using the infrastructure as a hardware or as operating system. So I'm using an application as a service. So yeah, this is SaaS, correct. The correct answer is true. The next question is, co-location means the capability to utilize the provider physical space and basic infrastructure like cooling system, like electricity, like ventilation, like generator maybe. Yeah. Great. So the correct answer is true. Yes, collocation means to use the physical facility of the cloud service provider rather than using infrastructure or platform. Yeah. Next question is the cloud model in where cloud service are potentially available to any customer and resources are controlled by the provider. And take a very careful look at the word any. It's like it's aiming in something open. Okay, so yeah, the correct answer is the public cloud, because you are referring to any customer that can allocate these services or benefit from these cloud service providers. So as long as it's any customer, so we are talking about public services, public service provider. So now we are talking about the model, which is used exclusively by single customer, and the resources are controlled by the provider. So yeah, so 100% answer is correct. The correct answer is number two. The private cloud model is exclusively by single customers. So I am single customer and I'm using my virtual private cloud or my service. So this is dedicated for me and exclusively allocated for me. The next poll is: the defined service model should always be underwritten by comprehensive something that conform the cloud usage agreement. Is it change request? Is it service level agreement? Is it technical proposal? What's the name of this document that who is responsible for what? Yeah, so the correct answer is answer number two, which is the service level agreement that is define who is responsible for what. In such category, the customer typically relies on provider for all monitoring and logging. And remember, in SaaS service, I am using only the application. So maintaining the logs for my server or for my application is my responsibility or the provider responsibility. Management of the logging system is responsibility of what? The provider or myself. So yeah, the correct answer is True. Okay, in SaaS category, and again, I'm using only the application, the customer doesn't have the permission to perform vulnerability assessment and penetration testing, and the customer relies on the provider to perform this activity. Is it true or not? And the correct answer is true. So yeah, myself as a SaaS, I'm using SaaS category. I don't have the authority to perform this type of testing on the infrastructure, so I can rely on the provider to maybe get my reports or to perform this activity for my application server. Customers have final responsibility for securing or the security of their cardholder data. Is it true or not? Should I ensure that the service provider is doing their job properly, providing up-to-date PCI compliance program, or I should leave it for the written agreement? Yeah, and the correct answer is true. Even if the cloud service provider is doing PCI program and maintaining the program, my final responsibility is to ensure that the provider is doing it properly. Because at the end, the data hosted on the cloud service provider is my data, not the cloud data. Even if it's these terms is written in the document, I have to ensure and assure that the cloud service provider is maintaining a very well practical, up-to-date PCI compliance program. And this one before the last, the allocation of physical or virtual resources, such multiple cloud tenants and their computation data is called what? Yeah, and the correct answer is the third one. This is the definition of the multi-tenancy. It's the allocation of physical or logical or virtual resources, such multiple cloud tenants. And the last question is, you can select multiple here. Okay, great. So the customer should actually, it's all the answer. The customer should compare provider services and evaluate them all and understand what each service provider is offering. So the answer, the correct answer is 3 of them. All of them are correct. Here it comes to the end of the content and the quiz. I would like to thank you all for joining, and I'm going now to open panel discussion, open discussion. If anyone has a question, please don't hesitate to unmute yourself and ask either in Arabic or in English. Okay, I think no one has anything to ask. Great. So yeah. Any discussion, any question regarding the PCI compliance in cloud? If there is no question, I would like to wrap this session and thank you all for joining us. It was a pleasure that you shared me with this hour of workshop. If no one has a question, so we can end the workshop. I hope if anyone, I think we have something. أستاذ علي بس تعمل ميوت unmute و أستاذ علي بس تسوي unmute و
نعم تمام شكرا.
هلا حبيبي.
شكرا جزيلا عثمان وحبيبي توفيق على هذا الويبينار. انا للاسف يعني حضرت من نصه، بس ان شاء الله التسجيل يعني يكون موجود. شكرا على المعلومات طبعا، يعني دائما انتم الويبينارز ريتش ما شاء الله. زين، أنا عندي سؤال مهتم به وطبعا قد يكون مفيد بالنسبة للكلاود. أكيد يعني هو أوبشن مو سهل إنه يكون يعني الداتا، خاصة أكثر الشركات تتخيل إنه الكلاود هو يعني شيء not recommended by PCI DSS أو غير مسموح. فتوضحتوا هاي الحقيقة إنه هذا الشيء ممكن، انه اخذ بريكشن واحتياطات المناسبه. انا سؤالي في حال انها قبل فتره صار عندنا مشكله بالامازون اذا الكل يذكر، وقد يصير يعني مشاكل قد تطول يوم او يومين او قد يصير داتا بريتش. بهاي الحاله يعني قد يعني تكون مع يعني السيرفيس بروفايدر او الميرشنت بعض البيانات موجوده يعني بالكلاود، فامام البي سي اي دي اس اس كومبلاينس راح يكون اني يعني عقوبات فاينز او شيء يعني من هذا باعتبار، مع العلم انه يعني اكيد طبعا اكو اجريمنت مع السيرفيس بروفايدر.
صحيح.
بس يعني هل انه هاي الاجريمنت راح تكون كافيه؟ لان عاده خاصه يعني الشيء اللي صار قبل فتره انه تعطل الامازون لمده يعني يوم او اكثر، قد يصير داتا بريتش. يعني هذا اذا امكن توضيحها بالنسبه للكومبلاينس.
صح.
او يعني مسؤوليه السيرفيس بروفايدر او يعني اي شخص يعني او اي شركه لها علاقه بالبي سي اي دي اس اس كومبلاينس. شكرا
حبيبي، شكرا استاذ علي. سؤالك سؤال جدا مهم بصراحه. هلا بما يخص هذا الموضوع نرجع للفكره الاساسيه بالبي سي اي اللي هي طلعت لهي انه مين اللي عمل البريتش، يعني هو ديد ات. فوقت انا بكون اخذ الداتا، عامل هوستنج لابلكيشن عندي او لداتا بيز او لانفراستراكشر بكلاود. هلا اذا كان هذا الكلاود ما له بي سي اي كومبلاينت فاي تيك ذا انتاير ريسبونسابيلتي، رح يكون المسؤوليه كلها علي انا ككاستمر، لانه انا ما عرفت اختار الكلاود بروفايدر صح بالنسبه لي اللي بيخدمني بموضوع الكومبلاينس. هلا اذا كان الكلاود سيرفيس بروفايدر كومبلاينت مع البي سي اي، انا هون بدي بقى شوف الاجريمنت بيني وبينه وهو باي بارت كومبلاينت. يعني انا مثلا استاذ علي اذا هو كان كومبلاينت بموضوع الكولوكيشن، يعني هو بس كومبلاينت مع ريكوايرمنت نمبر 9، الريكوايرمنت رقم 9 بالبي سي اي، وانا صار عندي مثلا بريتش بسبب الانتي مالوير، فهون الكلاود سيرفيس بروفايدر ما دخله، هون الريسبونسبيلتي از ماين، لانه انا ما عملت كنترول صح على موضوع الانتي مالوير. فهون يعني لازم دائما يكون العلاقه بين الكاستمر والكلاود سيرفيس بروفايدر جدا واضحه. وانا مشان هيك يعني وقت كنا
زين السؤال
تفضل.
وضحت الفكره. بهاي الحاله اللي راح يحلها هو الانفستيجيشن، يعني الكيو اس انفستيجيشن كيو اس اي.
صحيح بيعملوا مثل انفستيجيشن وفورنسكس.
تمام. يعني حيكون شخص اوفيشال كواليفايد من البي سي اي هو اللي راح يكون.
تمام. صحيح، يرفع كليم على المحكمه وبيتدخل الاطراف المعنيه.
تمام. انا سالت هذا السؤال لان يعني اتوقع انه هاي النقطه مو واضحه لاغلب الشركات، يعني خاصه موضوع الفاينز والعقوبات، يعني موضوع مهم جدا.
حتى مو كلاود، خلينا يعني ما كثير نبعد بالفكره. يعني هلا هون نحن خلينا نحكي ضمن العراق مثلا، في مثلا بنوك في بينها وبين البيمنت سيرفيس بروفايدر اجريمنت، تمام؟ ممكن تشغيل اي تي امات، ممكن تشغيل بي او اسات. هلا الاجريمنت بيناتهم ما له واضحه، اذا صار داتا بريتش فبتضيع القصه.
نعم تمام.
يعني
فعلا
يعني اللي ما عنده بهي الحاله اللي ما عنده بي سي اي هو اللي بيدفع الفاين. يعني خلينا نفرض انه البنك اكس هو البي اس بي واي، تمام؟ بيناتهم اجريمنت انه البيمنت سيرفيس بروفايدر بيشغل الاي تي امات للبنك. هلا اذا ما كان البنك عنده بي سي اي وكان البيمنت سيرفيس بروفايدر عنده بي سي اي وصار داتا بريتش، فالبنك هو اللي بيدفع الغرامه، لانه هو اللي ما عنده بي سي اي. يعني هو حتى لو كان الحق على البي اس بي، بس طالما اللي ما عنده بي سي اي هو الحلقه الاضعف خلينا نسميه، فهو اللي بيدفع الغرامه.
صحيح. طبعا هاي النقطة أشكرك على توضيحها، لأن يعني أنا فعلا ملاحظ إنه الأغلبية يتخيلون إنه هو البي سي اي دي اس اس كومبلاينس يعني إنه هي غير مطلوبة من عندهم، أو يتخيل إنه غير مطلوبة، فهي بنفس الوقت هي بالعكس راح توفر له حماية. أنا أشوف في حال إنه صار بريتش حتى إذا مو كان هو المخطئ، يعني أنا دائما أمثلها اذا انت تسوق سياره مثلا وما عندك رخصه قياده، حتى اذا مو انت المخطئ فبكل الاحوال حتصير انت المخطئ.
صحيح طبعا.
فنفس الشيء انا اشوف الكومبلاينس يعني هي توفر طبقه من الحمايه اللي احنا تعرف اللي هي اللايبيلتي، يعني مو
الليجل غير بالضبط اللايبيلتي بالضبط.
يعني هذا الفتشي اتمنى انه يعني الحاضرين يفهموه او يشرحوا لاداراتهم انه هذا الكومبلاينس فقط يعني ايضا هو لحمايه الشركه من اي مسؤوليه. بالاخر الشخص او الشركه الغير كومبلاينت راح تتحمل مسؤوليه قد اخطاء غيرها. انا برايي يعني اخطاء
السيرفيس طبعا
مثلا سبيل المثال، لان من تصير مشكله الكل راح يتخلى عن انه هو يكون سبب المشكله.
صح، كله حيقول انا هذا يعني مو انا. والمشكله استاذ علي عم نشوف انه في اجريمنتس يعني هي ضبابيه جدا يعني
مو
موضوع مزعج
ناضجه.
بصراحه.
نعم الاجريمنت مو ناضجه، لان السيرفيس بروفايدر قد يكون مستوى نضوجه اعلى من الكاستمر ومن البانكس، فبالتالي يحمي نفس البانكس عموما الموجوده يعني. واحنا نعذرهم بس سابقا نعذرهم، بس حاليا يعني انه مستوى النضوج بالاجريمنت ضعيف جدا. فهذا يعني يحتاج انه اكيد يعني لازم موضوع البي سي اي دي اس اس اويرنس يعني لحد الان ضعيفه بصراحه يعني عموما كريجوليشن. فالموضوع
صحيح.
يعني يحتاج وقت، بس يعني حاليا الموضوع بدا يتضح. قبل كان يعني اكو جهل بالموضوع، حاليا الريسورسز موجوده على النت يعني عموما. وبكل الاحوال يعني هو بعدين الاغلبيه راح يعرفون اهميه الموضوع بعد ما احنا نقول بعراقي الفاس يوقع بالراس.
صحيح.
بعد ما تصير فاينز وغرامات واشياء ثانيه تخص السمعه يعني
هي
هذا الشيء صعب.
في مقوله بيقولوها كثير جماعه البي سي اي استاذ علي، اذا مفكر انه الكومبلاينس يعني اذا الكومبلاينس مكلف فجرب النون كومبلاينس.
فعلا هو هذا الشيء هو يعني حتى الكومبلاينس. انت اذا تروح على صفحه الكومبلاينس مرات يعني اذا تشوف انه شركه مثلا سسبندد مثلا او الكومبلاينت توقف عنه، هذا بحد ذاته يعني شيء صعب جدا بالنسبه للشركات يعني.
صح.
فتخيل انه يصير عمليه فرض غرامات، وهذا الشيء متوقع جدا لان بالعراق الاونلاين سيرفيسز بدت يعني حاليا بدت، فمتوقع جدا انه. فانا اشوف انه مو المساله بس هي مساله نتورك سكيورتي او حمايه الكاستمر كارد داتا، لا هي مساله ايضا حمايه لللايبيلتي يعني الخاصه بالشركه نفسها، راح توفر لها حمايه اضافيه ضد الاشياء القانونيه. يعني هذا انا رايي.
تمام. حتى استاذ علي يعني يعني اذا بالطب مثلا بالويب سايت تبع البي سي اي مثلا بتسال انه هل هي ريكوايرد للبنوك ولا لا، وهي كثير بنسمع نحن بالعراق وضمن الدول العربيه، خصوصي بالبلاد اللي فيها ميتيجيشن لموضوع البيمنت سيرفيس بروفايدر على ثيرد بارتيز مثل بالعراق مثلا. فبيقول لك طب انا ما عندي كارد هولدر داتا، ليش اعمل بي سي اي؟ هلا البي سي اي ما بتقول لك انه انت برات السكوب ولا بتقول لك انت بالسكوب، بتقول لك ارجع للريجوليتوري. فهون يعني هون كمان لازم يكون في خليني اقول من طرف البنوك يعني وعي اكثر تجاه الداتا اللي بالكور بانكينج، لانه هي حتى لو ما كان فيها اونلاين داتا بس هي ستيل هي داتا عملاء وارقام حسابات وارقام ماليه، يعني ممكن تكون فيها فضايح. فهي حتى لو ما لها بالنسبه للبي سي اي كونسل هي ان سكوب، بس بالنسبه للبنوك هي داتا مهمه مثل داتا التامين او خلينا نسميه داتا المرضى بقلب مشفى.
صحيح.
فالموضوع ايكويفالنت.
هو وبنفس الوقت يعني انه توضيح يجوز مثلا بالنسبه للبنوك الكومبلاينس سكوب راح يكون طبعا اصغر بكثير من الاي بيمنت كومباني يعني. فالموضوع حتى من ناحيه ماديه ومو بنفس يعني كلفه السيرفيس بروفايدر والاي بيمنت. وبنفس الوقت بصراحه اللوجو للبي سي اي دي اس كومبلاينت هو اشوفه يفتح فرص للبزنس يعني اكبر من قيمه الماديه بصراحه للكومبلاينت يعني هو بحد ذاته يعني اللوجو مهم جدا كبي سي اي كومبلاينت، اهم من الايزو وغيره طبعا يعني. هذا اللوجو يعني من ناحيه تجاريه اقصد، اضافه للناحيه
بالفاينانشال اندستري. صحيح.
نعم صحيح، لا اكيد طبعا بالفاينانشال. شكرا عثمان على التوضيحات، اشكرك.
حبيبي استاذ علي،
شكرا. مع السلامه.
في احد حابب يضيف شيء؟ في استفسارات بعد ممكن نجاوب عليها؟ I think بعتقد ما في أي أسئلة. أنا جدا بتشكركم لوجودكم معنا. إن شاء الله كانت workshop وسيشن خفيفة عليكم. بتمنى إذا حدا حتى عنده أسئلة بعد الويبينار أو بعد الوركشوب كان تحكوا معنا باللينكدين أو على الإيميل، تتواصلوا for أي clarification. ممنون جدا لوقتكم وإن شاء الله ليلة سعيدة للجميع. يعطيكم ألف عافية. Thank you all for joining and have a wonderful evening. Bye bye.